From trying to catch a bouquet at a wedding to scattering rose petals in a graveyard, humans have developed some truly peculiar ways to find out if love and romance are in their future. Let's take a look at some of their chosen methods of love divination in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. It is February the 13th, which makes it Valentine's Eve, I guess. Nobody ever calls it that, which is peculiar because almost every other Saint's Day has an Eve where you're supposed to do things for it. But anyway, obviously I wasn't going to put this out on Sunday because that would be silly because I like to post things on a Saturday. So we are going to be having a look this week at love magic and folklore because obviously last week we looked at apotropaic protective marks and so on. And I should point out obviously that as much as we delved into a lot of these protective practices last week, there is still no real way of knowing why people did the things they did and if they were actually completely mundane or if they did actually have a folkloric purpose. This week, on the other hand, is very much stuff that people did for a specific end goal, and these things have been recorded in recipe books and in documents and in sort of folklore that's being collected and so on. So we don't know whether any of them worked, but we do know that people were aware of these practices and so on. So that's going to be a little bit of a change of pace this week. But one thing that is worth bearing in mind is that it's quite difficult to know which area of a person's life attracts the most stuff around magic and ritual and all that kind of jazz. Is it love or money? You do get quite a lot of things for health as well, but I do think that trying to become more wealthy or trying to have love in your life do seem to be quite popular topics. And ultimately, let's be honest, there's not actually anything wrong with wanting more of either of them. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why folklore absolutely bursts at the seams with various charms and practices to help people to bring more of it into their life. So obviously we're not going to look at money this week, although I might actually do that for the last week in February, just because there's loads of stuff and the folklore of finance is quite interesting. But this week we're going to have a look at love magic and folklore. Now, I should point out before we go any further that even royalty was not above apparently using love magic, or at least appearing to do so, because in 1469, Jacquetta, the Duchess of Bedford, was accused of using witchcraft to compel Edward IV to marry her daughter, Elizabeth Woodville. I think part of that was because nobody could believe that a king would choose a relatively, lowborn, as it were, personage as his wife, but that's what happened. He married her, and people decided it must have been witchcraft. Now, Sophie Page does talk about accounts of love magic actually existing in the written records, and an old belief explains that practitioners of love magic would essentially work with Venus, and that's both planet and goddess, and any spirits that were thought to be under her control. And naturally, there's no way of knowing if ordinary people gave praise to Venus, but this is indeed what the records say. Elsewhere, demons actually had divine permission to, and I quote, arouse the senses. And basically they were doing this to tempt people so that these people could figure out their specific weaknesses and then basically work on them. So demons were actually allowed to do this. And some people believe that some demons might focus on carnal love, shall we say, and that's what Sophie Page calls it, or they might then use their astrological knowledge to incite lust. So basically the theory was that these demons were using the same knowledge of Venus and so on in order to make people more lusty. I'm sure that people probably did use that as an excuse. However, the demonic side of love magic is massive, and I don't really think it's necessarily worth going into here because I kind of feel like it's a bit more instructive to focus on the potions and charms that were available to more regular people. And some of what we're going to have a look at is divination, so that's the practice of trying to foretell the future around love. And then we're also going to have a look at some potions and some charms and some of the magical practices that were recommended to bring a new love into your life, or to at least help you know who that love might be. One caveat before we start, obviously you do have to remember ethics, because if you are going to cast a spell to bring love into your life, that's fine. If you're just saying, I would like to bring love into my life, it's nice and vague, you're not specific about the identity of your next partner, life's grand. However, if you're trying to affect a individual person, you're essentially now getting into interfering with someone's free will, and that is just so awful from a consent point of view. And it's also, think about it this way, would you want someone to do that to you? So I'm going to hazard a guess and say no. I do have some specific love spells on my blog, and I will put the links to those in the show notes below. So we're not going to focus on specific spells. These are more like divinatory things and stuff like that. So without any further ado, let's get on with the episode. So we're going to start out with love potions, also known as philtres, and they were popular from the Middle Ages until the 17th century, and that's when spells and charms became a lot more popular. And in many ways, the decline in popularity of the philtre was largely due to the way that you had to administer them. So the way that it worked was you chose the person who you wanted to fall in love with you, and you then gave them the philtre to drink, and then ultimately they were supposed to then fall wildly in love with you, and you'd have a happy ever after, apparently. Now, clearly this is horrible in terms of consent, and obviously something that cannot be condoned in the modern era. And indeed, Roman biographer Suetonius actually claimed that Caligula had drunk a love philtre given to him by his wife Caesonia, except it drove him mad instead. Now, on one hand, that's a nice way of getting around the whole Caligula's mad thing, but it does also show that these things can go horribly wrong. Now, many philtre recipes actually start out with a base of wine, tea or water, and then you add herbs and other ingredients as well. And mandrake was a common ingredient, despite the fact that obviously it's poisonous, along with bryony and fernseed in England. Now, the funny thing about this is it does say that if you want to use fernseed, you need to gather them on St. John's Eve, except ferns produce spores, not seeds. So I'm wondering if someone's just written it down wrong, or if that's some kind of practical joke. Who knows? Anyway. Vervain also appears in several recipes, along with various animal parts, which is obviously a bit rancid. And one medieval recipe, related by Rosemary Gailey, tells you to grind a dove's heart, a sparrow's liver, a swallow's womb, and a hare's kidney into a powder, and then you dry your own blood to a powder, and then add an equal part of that to the mixture. And then you add all of that powder to liquid, which needs to be drunk by your intended. And Girolamo Falengo even offered a recipe in the 16th century, and this contained, and I quote, black dust of tomb, venom of toad, flesh of brigand, lung of ass, blood of blind infant, corpses from graves, bile of ox. And quite frankly, it sounds a lot more like death metal lyrics, but there's no evidence as to whether this formula actually worked. I mean, I think the bit for me is just the really broad corpses from graves. There's no concept of what you're supposed to do with them. But yeah, so that's what Falengo decided was a good set of ingredients, because nothing says love and romance like tomb dust, toad venom, and body parts. So yeah, bless him. Now, the biggest problem with philtres, as I've said, is actually getting your intended to drink it, because I can imagine a lot of these things probably smelled and tasted absolutely foul. Now, alternatives did exist, such as rubbing vervain juice into your hands and then touching your intended, obviously much more straightforward, but it does still rely on forcing someone to do something they may not want to do. So that was philtres, and that's basically, as I say, why they fell out of fashion, was just because it was too awkward to try and persuade someone to drink this thing that you'd had made. And there are some cases where people have then got things from the person themselves, or they've added hair and things, and it's all to kind of try and bind you together as people, and it just sounds absolutely rank. And speaking of rank, there's another one that I want to tell you, which is actually a love charm which involves dead bodies. So this one, again, horrible in terms of consent, as in there is none. And this was related by Lady Jane Francesca Wilde in 1888 from Ireland. And what you were supposed to do is you were supposed to take a piece of skin from a corpse's arm, and then you needed to tie it to the person that they wanted to love you. So you've got, I quite fancy this guy, so I'm going to take this bit of skin from a corpse's arm, and then I'm going to tie it onto him while he's asleep. And this is the thing, you needed to tie it on while the person was asleep and then remove it before they woke up. So it's kind of, I have a sense of those games like Buckaroo where you put things on and you've got to try and do it before it suddenly goes bang and throws everything off. It kind of feels a little bit like a weird necromantic version of that. But then the woman also needs to carefully preserve this little sliver of skin to retain her lover's ardour. Now, if that wasn't enough, you could also put the skin strip under your head while you slept so that you would dream of your future husband. So according to Lady Wilde, a servant girl actually tried it for a laugh, so she put the skin under her pillow, went to sleep, and then she dreamed of her master. And you think, oh well, that's a bit weird, but whatever. And then when the lady of the family died, the servant girl decided, oh, hang on, this is an interesting opportunity. And she then tried to tie the dead skin to the arm trick. So she got a bit of skin from a corpse. How she did this, I don't know, the story doesn't say. But anyway, she got this piece of corpse's skin, tied it to the master's arm, removed it in time, and then lo and behold, massively fell in love with her, and then married her within the year. Now, the problem was, a year and a day after the wedding, a fire broke out in her bedroom, and then this completely destroyed the strip of skin. And almost immediately it broke the charm, and the master basically decided he hated her. And the story goes to like quite a lot of points to say that she was horrifically ugly, which I just think is like adding insult to injury, really. It's like people can be less than conventionally attractive and still find love, but whatever. And yeah, so this is basically what this story says. So she tried all this and it didn't work. She did actually confess what had happened, and apparently was then ostracised for essentially having used magic to win his heart. And it's a horrible practice, and you do think, were people just like going around nicking bits off dead bodies to use in love charms? And the problem is, you read all this and you go, you know what, that's still preferable to using Tinder. But anyway, we are going to move on to divination, which is a little bit less icky, because in this particular section doesn't involve dead body parts, which is always a nice thing, I think. But if you're single and you don't want to be, it's quite natural that you would turn to divination. And to be honest with you, asking about love or future partners is one of the most common types of divination on record. And if you look at some tarot readers or mediums, they actually offer specific readings for love and romance because it's such a huge area. But the thing is, with these romantic techniques that we're going to cover, they don't involve any extra tools like tarot cards or runes or anything like that. It's largely with stuff that you would actually have around the house, which makes them a lot more accessible. And it kind of then feels a lot less like you're doing magic and more like you're just doing a fun little ritual to produce a desired result. Now, Jacqueline Simpson and Steve Roud actually know that there's a formula to a lot of these procedures, and you do start to notice it after a while. But essentially, they're boiled down to the idea that you need to do something a certain way at a certain time to learn something about your love life and or influence it in some way. Now, obviously, the minute you're starting to influence an outcome, you are actually then branching off into love magic, whereas just simply wanting to learn something is what makes it straight divination. And the types of divination cluster at certain times of the year. So you've got Halloween, St. Agnes's Eve, Valentine's Day for obvious reasons, you've got Midsummer's Eve and New Year. They seem to be like the main times when these things are supposed to be particularly potent. And here it's the power of the day then adds to the divination to give it a bit more clout. And often you'll find that the divination is then performed at midnight, which gives it even more oomph. Now, we are going to have a look at a couple of those kind of practices, but the general ones, we've covered them before because it's, the things like brushing your hair while looking into a mirror on Halloween to see the face of your intended, or peeling an apple and throwing the skin over your shoulder and then looking to see what shape initial the peel has formed. Things like that, I think they're quite common in sort of they're quite common in the public consciousness, as it were. Although I should point out before we get into some of these practices that Simpson and Rowe do note that there's a very specific type of wedding divination which is way less complex. And a really popular one would quite simply be the rite of throwing the bouquet to determine who the next person to marry would be. And then you've also got the other one, which is putting a piece of the wedding cake under your pillow would mean that you would apparently dream of your intended. So that's really easy and actually quite accessible to most people. And in a lot of ways, it's also like a cultural form of divination that everybody sort of joins in with because it's become a tradition. So that's quite interesting. But one of the forms of divination that I wanted to share with you for Valentine's Day, and we did cover it in the Valentine's Day episode like last year, but in case you haven't got to that one yet, this one is Ornithomancy, which is basically love divination using birds. And what it ultimately involves is paying attention to the first bird that you see on Valentine's Day, which would predict your future partner's career. Now, all of the folklore does aim this at women, and it does talk about a future husband, but quite frankly, it's the 21st century, and a lot of this folklore could do with being updated. So basically, single people, have a look out the window and see what the first bird is that you see on Valentine's Day to predict your future partner's career. So it's an example of some of the ones that you might find. A canary means a doctor, a goldfinch is a wealthy person, doves indicate a happy marriage, a magpie is like someone who's quite entrepreneurial and dedicated to business and so on, and woodpeckers unfortunately mean that you'll stay unmarried. Now, the folklore, unfortunately, doesn't actually say if it needs to be a physical bird or an image of one. And like, I was thinking, well, where I am, if I look out the window, I'm most likely to see a pigeon, which is someone who will eventually return to their place of birth, a sparrow, which is a landscape gardener or a tree surgeon, or a blackbird, which is an aid worker or vicar first. So then I'm like, do I look out the window, or is it just the first one that I encounter? So if I saw an image of, say, a kingfisher on telly, would that count? I don't know. It doesn't say. Probably not because of the age of the practice. But ultimately, your environment is going to kind of dictate which bird you see. So it's quite an interesting one. And it's a really easy one to do as well. It's just literally look out the window. What's the first bird that you see? So that's something that we can all try, I think. And we're going to move on to love charms, which are actually essentially a form of divination. So I've put these in as a slightly separate section. And we've talked about charms before in the fact that they essentially just exist as a short rhyming verse that's spoken aloud either while you're doing an action or while making a talisman. And it does make them an incredibly accessible form of magical practice, and they're quite acceptable even to those who would never dream of practicing actual witchcraft. So a really good example of a popular and quite innocuous charm would be starlight, star bright, first star that I see tonight. I wish I may, I wish I might have this wish I wish tonight. That is essentially a charm. So obviously when you think about it, you've got all the stuff around divination, and naturally people would then turn to charms as part of this drive to find love. And this is where they do then dovetail with the divination. And Laura Mitchell explores the way that these love charms have changed over time, particularly a specific ritual from the 16th century. Now, back in the original time, and this was taken from the margins of a recipe book, the person who wanted to know who they would marry was directed to sow hemp seed around their fire on New Year's Day while reciting a particular rhyme. I'm not even going to attempt to try and recite it because it's written in like Old English and I can't read that. But what they should then do is go to bed, lie on their right hand side, and to speak only to recite their prayers before bed. Which is fair enough. That's actually quite easy. It's quite straightforward. And it would be something that someone would be able to do to see if they were going to meet someone in the year to come. New Year's Day obviously being one of those like magical days. But by the late 19th century, the ritual had changed somewhat. And a version of this was shown in the BBC programme Victorian Farm. And Laura Mitchell discusses this as well. Because by this point, a woman who wanted to know who she would marry was now directed not to use her own fireplace, but rather to go to her local churchyard at midnight on Midsummer's Eve. And there she should then just scatter hemp seed while reciting the charm, hemp seed I sow, hemp seed will grow, he who will marry me, come after and more. And then she should either see her future husband in the churchyard or in her dreams. I've no idea if that's a vision of her future husband or her actual future husband, because that would be a bit freaky to see some dude lurking in a churchyard. But we'll just assume it's a vision of. Now, Mitchell notes the change in date from New Year's Day to Midsummer's Eve between these 16th and 19th century rituals. And obviously we don't know how accurate the BBC version was, but it is quite notable that the rhyme and the hemp seeds largely remain the same, but the prayers and fire are then replaced with a churchyard. So it's kind of a much more secular way of doing this particular practice. And also I would imagine more people would have access to a churchyard than an open fire in the middle of your room sort of thing. Simpson and Roud also relate an alternative version, which is to be performed on Midsummer's Eve. And with this one, at the stroke of 12, you were to run round the church scattering rose leaves and rosemary. And then you would chant, rose leaves, rose leaves, rose leaves I strew, he that will love me, come after me now. So again, you can see how similar this practice is to the hemp seed version. Now, I should point out that roses do make way more sense in a love charm, although Mitchell does suggest that the use of hemp might reference its use to make rope, thus binding the couple. Ultimately, we'll never really know if anyone did the 16th century version, and the 19th century version one may have been adapted for television, I don't know. But it may also have just simply been updated to take into account what was easier for people to do. And interestingly, there's also a variation on this particular charm that appeared in a 1914 issue of the Folklore Journal. And this version came from Jersey, where the single woman was again instructed to sow hemp seed, but outside in her garden. And the charm ran, hemp seed sow, hemp seed grow, for my true love to come and mow. She had to then hurry back to her house, basically to try and avoid the Grim Reaper, which is an interesting addition to this particular charm. But if she did turn and look back when she reached the door, she would then see her future husband mowing the seed that she'd just sown. So it's quite interesting how, in a lot of ways, the sowing of something, for someone to then come and interact with it in some ways, that part is very similar across the 19th and early 20th century versions. And there's another love charm again from Jersey, which involved putting your boots on the floor under your bed, and you basically put them in like a T shape underneath your pillow. So obviously again under your bed, but like where your pillow is, so that your head would be above the T while you're asleep. And then once in bed, you would say, I've put my shoes in the form of a T, hoping my true love to see. Let him be young or let him be old. Let him come and visit me. And then you were supposed to dream of him. Now, the final charm that we're going to have a look at, I think this is a lovely one, actually. It's actually an Italian one. And this comes from a dispatch that was sent to the Oakland Tribute from Amalfi in Italy. And this was sent in 1955. And it referred to a nearby grotto used in love magic. And it was called the Grotto of the Pirate. And single girls were advised to go there by moonlight. And then once they were there, they needed to throw 3 pebbles at a particular rock. And apparently it was like jutting out of the water, so it was quite easy to find. Now, surprisingly, it didn't actually matter whether they hit it or they completely missed it. It was just the act of throwing the 3 pebbles towards this rock that was important. Although apparently it was considered useful to sort of say a couple of names that they quite fancied during the pebble tossing. And the dispatch did note that older people in the area commented that girls rarely needed to return to perform it a second time. So you do have to wonder, was that actually one that seemed to bear some kind of fruit? So as we come to a close with this episode, there is the question, did such love magic actually work? Now, aside from the Amalfi Grotto charm, which does kind of rely on anecdotes, there are no real records of these practices actually having been used. So yes, we have a record of their existence because they do appear in these various books and collections, and as I say, even a recipe book, but we don't have the results to go with them. And much the same way that if you look at a recipe book of food, you have no idea if anybody actually tried any of the food recipes unless anyone's actually written on, like my mother does, whether the food's any good or not. Now, to be fair, by all the laws of averages, at least some of the people who used these divination methods must have had some kind of result, though whether that's through their efficacy or their coincidence is completely lost to time. And it is one of those things as well that you'd be far more likely to try a practice if a friend said, oh, I tried it and it worked. You would be more likely to try it and therefore you would then pass it on as well. So again, we don't know with a lot of these things how widespread they actually were. Now obviously over the centuries the desire to compel another to love you was basically replaced by a desire to simply know that there was a partner in the future, because, you know, if nothing else, these practices do serve to provide some comfort to the single or the lonely or both. And after all, to be honest, as I said at the beginning, there is nothing more human than wanting a meaningful emotional connection with someone else. Obviously, the onward march of time does then give rise to its own folkloric practices, so look at the trend for attaching padlocks to bridges, because nothing says love like scratching your initials into a cheap padlock and then leaving it behind. Now, who knows what we'll be doing to attract and commemorate love in future decades, but it'll be really interesting to see what practices people do now that have been maintained from centuries before, or what people are creating now. It'll be really fascinating to find that out. So I hope you enjoyed that particular episode. If you are listening on Saturday or Sunday, if you don't have a Valentine, or you're sitting there going, oh, I hate Valentine's Day, I'm not going to get anything, then consider this episode my Valentine to you. If, on the other hand, you do have a partner, I hope that you have a jolly time and it's all quite lovely and everything goes well. Next week, we are going to have a look at protective charms for the person, as in the body. So we'll be looking at more like personal charms and amulets and protective devices and all that kind of jazz. And yeah, like I say, I think I might actually do a lot of this stuff that's similar to love magic, but just for money instead at the end of February, because I'm pretty sure that we could probably all do with a spare quid or two. So I hope that you've enjoyed this episode. I know it's been a little bit longer, but again, it's just because there's so much to fit in. If you have enjoyed it, awesome. Please do feel free to leave me a review. They do actually help, and does then mean that the platforms are more likely to recommend the podcast to other people. So, folklore can indeed beat the algorithm, which I think will be marvellous. And other than that, I'm going to be doing an episode on the Kaliak for my Patreon exclusive supporters. So if you're interested in that, the $3.50 a month tier will get access to that, and also all the 12 or something exclusive episodes that we've had before that. But anyway, without any further ado, I hope you have a marvellous week ahead. I hope you do have a wonderful Valentine's Day, and I will see you next week for protective magic and talismans and all that kind of jazz. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.